Welcome to part two. Let's get a couple of things out of the way first. Who was Anselm of Canterbury, and what does the word ontological mean? Anselm was an Italian monk, philosopher and theologian of the Catholic Church who became Archbishop of Canterbury in England. After his death, Anselm was canonized. He became a saint in the Catholic Church. He is the first one to have formulated the ontological argument for the existence of God. If you look in the glossary, you will see that ontology is the study of being, of what exists. Ontology seeks to clarify the sense or senses in which a thing may be said to be or to exist, and to provide an account of the most basic categories of being. That definition of the word makes it sound as if any argument for the existence of God should be called an ontological argument. In fact, that isn't right. The next argument for the existence of God that we're going to examine is called the design argument, not the ontological argument. I suspect, though I don't actually know, that the ontological argument is so called because its premises, which we'll get onto in a moment, are explicitly about existence, unlike the design argument. Anselm's work, the Proslogion, or Discourse, written almost 1,000 years ago, contains the ontological argument, and you have an excerpt from that in the Norton Anthology. This lovely illustration of Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury is from a 12th century edition of his Prayers and Meditations. It's crucial when arguing for the existence of God, or alternatively arguing against the existence of God, to be clear about what we mean by God, because there are so many candidates. We might mean something very specific, something specific to a particular religion. We might mean the Christian God, the Holy Trinity, the Islamic God, Allah, the Jewish God, Yahweh, the Roman God, Jupiter, and so on. Or we might mean the architect and creator of the universe, or the source of meaning and morality, or just a higher spiritual force. Well, we mean none of these as far as the ontological argument goes. Rather, we mean candidate number 5, an absolutely perfect being, omnibenevolent, that is, all-loving, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipotent, all-powerful. Let me pause at this moment to mention a puzzle about omnipotence. Here is a mighty stone in Australia's Northern Territory, Uluru, or Ayers Rock, sacred to the local Aboriginal people. Consider the question, if God is omnipotent, could he make a stone he couldn't lift? Well, suppose the answer is yes. Well, then it looks like God is not omnipotent, after all, because he can't lift that stone. Suppose, on the other hand, that the answer is no. Then again, he's not omnipotent, because he can't make that stone. So either way, if God is omnipotent, he isn't, and therefore he's not omnipotent. That last bit, if God is omnipotent, he isn't, so he isn't, is worth thinking about after you've done the quiz on arguments. If it remains puzzling, ask your TA on Friday. What is the solution to the paradox of omnipotence? Have we shown that there couldn't be an omnipotent being, and so there must be something wrong with the ontological argument, at least if it's intended to secure the conclusion that there is such a being? I will leave that as an exercise for you to think about. here is Anselm's view of existence. It might seem a bit odd at first, but it's actually not that far removed from our ordinary way of speaking. There are two ways of existing. You can either exist in the mind or in the understanding, or you can exist in reality. To say that something exists in the mind or the understanding is just to say that we can think about that thing. So Hogwarts, the school in Harry Potter, is something we can think about thanks to J.K. Rowling. So it exists in the mind. Mermaids also exist in the mind, as does the monster under the bed. We might say to a frightened child who thinks there's a monster under her bed that it's all in your mind. It's a figment of your imagination. Some things exist both in the mind and in reality. You, MIT, the planet Neptune, for example. Whereas Hogwarts and mermaids and the monster under the bed exist just in the mind or in the understanding. They don't also exist in reality. Some things exist in reality but don't exist in the mind because we don't think about them. We don't know that they exist. So there are some remote planets, no doubt, out there which we have not yet discovered. Maybe we never will discover them. Those planets exist in reality, but they don't exist in the mind. Similarly, for undiscovered enzymes, and so on. Now, you've noticed that I have drawn the diagram to represent the view of reality according to the atheist, or the fool of Psalm 14 in the Bible, who says in his heart that there is no God. Of course, in saying that, the atheist is thinking about God, so God exists in the mind, but according to the atheist, that's it. God does not also exist in reality. And of course, the ontological argument is supposed to show that that's wrong, and God, rather, should be placed at the intersection. God exists both in the mind and in reality. Here is a version of the ontological argument. It's slightly simplified from the one on pages 11 to 12 of the Norton Anthology. There are typically different ways of setting out arguments in philosophy and elsewhere. So, by God, we mean an absolutely perfect being. We've got some premises here from which we intend to derive the conclusion. You can think of this as an attempt to prove, in the same sense in which there are proofs in mathematics, the existence of God. And this is the argument that Anselm presents in Proslogion 2. He has another argument in Proslogion 3. See page 9 of the Norton Anthology. Here we're just going to focus on the Proslogion 2 argument. So we've got the first premise, God exists in the mind. Why is that true? Well, it's just true because we can think about God. Now we've got premise 2, which actually is a consequence of premise 1. So once we've got premise 1 on the table, we don't need to do any more work to get, or make any further assumptions to get premise 2. That's just a logical consequence of premise 1. Premise 2 is either God exists in the mind alone or exists in both the mind and reality. Premise 3 is if God exists in the mind alone, God is not perfect. That seems plausible. Surely it is more perfect to exist in reality than to merely exist in the mind. Now we just need one other premise. God is perfect, but that's trivial. Just follows from our stipulative definition of God as an absolutely perfect being. And from premise 2, premise 3, and premise 4, it would seem to straightforwardly follow that God exists in the mind and reality, and so exists in reality. In other words, if you accept premise 2, premise 3, and premise 4, you really have no other option but to accept the conclusion that God exists in reality. So that, at least superficially, looks very much like the Holy Grail, an actual proof of the existence of God understood as an absolutely perfect being. But maybe it's not right. Gaunelo was a French Benedictine monk, a contemporary of Anselm's, and his complaint against the argument of Proslogion 2 is that, in effect, it proves too much. In other words, if Anselm's argument succeeds, a similar argument shows that there is an absolutely perfect island. But that is absurd. There is no such island. So Anselm's argument must have gone wrong somewhere. Here is the parallel argument to the one on the previous slide for Gaunelo's absolutely perfect island. This is not quite the way Gaunelo himself puts it in the selection in the Norton Anthology, but it seems pretty close to what he had in mind. So, some stipulative terminology. API abbreviates an absolutely perfect island. An island with the most agreeable climate. It never rains, if you think that is an imperfection in the climate of islands. The most gorgeous beaches, and so on. First premise. API exists in the mind. Well, why is that? Well, we can think about API. We just did. From which it follows that, premise 2, either API exists in the mind alone or exists in both the mind and reality. Now, surely, as before, if API exists in the mind alone, API is not perfect. That is, as before, to exist in the mind alone is to be less perfect than to exist in the mind and also to exist in reality. That seems plausible enough. Surely the premise 3 of this argument is just as plausible as premise 3 of the earlier argument. Premise 4, API is perfect. Well, that's trivial for exactly the same reason that the parallel premise of the previous argument is trivial. And so from P2, P3, and P4, we get the conclusion that an absolutely perfect island exists in the mind and reality, and so exists in reality. So here are 2 questions for you. As is usual, I'm not going to try to give you the answer to these philosophical questions. Rather, I'm just going to try and give you as many tools as I can to help you answer them for yourself. First question. Has Gaunelo really proved that a perfect island exists if Anselm has proved that God exists? In other words, is it true that the 2 arguments stand or fall together? Perhaps there is some disanalogy between the 2 arguments. They're not entirely parallel. So Anselm can prove that God exists, even if Gaunelo didn't prove that a perfect island exists. That's the first question. Then the second question is, if you think that the 2 arguments really are parallel, they stand or fall together, and so presumably they fall together since a perfect island doesn't exist, What exactly is the flaw in Anselm's argument? Gounelot's objection is all very well, but it doesn't explain, of course, where Anselm's argument goes wrong. The point is that we can't just stop at a yes to the first question if we're to be intellectually responsible. We have to go on to investigate exactly what the flaw in Anselm's argument is.